I hope you're starting to get used to seeing these data type icons around the Grasshopper UI as well as in the definitions. Now, what does Grasshopper do when we convert from one data type to another? Let's start by looking at what happens with a Boolean data type. I'll use the Boolean toggle that we've seen before to test this. I'm going to go to params, input, and Boolean toggle. So remember, this is either a true or a false value. What happens when we pass this true or a false value through, let's say, a params primitive integer? At first, we already should recognize that everything is more or less okay with the component at least. It knows what to do with the data. It can do something with the data that you've plugged into the input. Let's see the result. I'm going to go to params input and panel. I'm going to clean up this panel a little bit. I'm going to right click on it and uncheck draw paths as well as draw indices. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. I'll also change the font setting to sans serif here to make it a little bit clearer to read. When we pass a false through an integer, we get 0. If we double click that, when we set a true through an integer, we get a 1. And that can be useful, and we'll see some examples of that later on. Grasshopper here is automatically converting from a true or false when we pass it through this integer to a 0 or a 1. What happens if we, for example, try a params primitive and number? Let's copy the panel, and it does something similar. It just adds a value after the decimal. Does a Boolean convert to a text? Indeed, it does. And actually, anything you plug into a panel converts to a text. All data types have some textual representation in order for us to read what's going on. Similarly, you can pass all of these back to a Boolean. So if I go to params, primitive, and Boolean, all of these convert back to either true or false. I'll copy these three panels and just align them a little bit. So you can see that these kind of conversions happen automatically in Grasshopper. Now, is there anything that the Boolean does not necessarily translate to? Let's see. Params primitive, let's try a color. I'm going to plug the Boolean into the color. Aha! In this case, the component turns red. Let's see what the output is. The output is null. The component is trying to tell us something about its error. Let's click here on the little bubble. Data conversion failed from Boolean to color. In this case, Grasshopper has no clear assumption about what a true means in terms of a color. Is it red? Is it green? Is it blue? What might be true in terms of color for you might be different from somebody else. There's just too many options. Grasshopper has no clear translation of a Boolean to a color. What about, let's say, a Boolean to a point? In this case also, data conversion failed from Boolean to point. Here, I guess you could argue that false would be a point at 0, 0, 0, and true would be a point at 1, 1, 1, but maybe that's just really not that useful. This also fails. This error is something you're going to see in different parts of the definition while you're learning to use Grasshopper, or even when you use Grasshopper. You're going to get this data conversion failed from Boolean to point. And not just from Boolean to point, but from some data type to some other data type. It's a pretty common error, so it's good that we see it now. Let's continue on here. I'm going to now bring down a slider, params input and number slider. Let's see, does the slider convert to a Boolean? Params primitive Boolean? And indeed it does. But what is the conversion? Let me copy the panel that we have here. All right. Here, it seems that it's all true until we get to 0. Anything that's not 0 is true. What about params primitive and integer? Let's copy down our panel once again. All right, so it seems here it's doing some rounding. When it goes above 0.5, the integer converts it to a 1, and below that, it'll be a 0. Okay, that's pretty typical. If we go to params primitive and number, well, it's the same data type. We're not really doing much conversion there. But I just put that there because we can actually use the params to collect data types and collect data and values, pass them around as well. Does a slider with a number in it convert to a color? Again, there's no clear way that Grasshopper is going to assume what you want that number to be. So here, it's not converting to a color. What about to a point? So if we go to params geometry and point as well, it's going to error out. Let's continue and upgrade a little bit. Let's bring down a vector point and construct point. Remember, this is the construct point. It has x, y, and z set to 0 automatically, and we get the point drawn in Rhino. Does this convert to a Boolean? Params primitive Boolean? It does, but which Boolean? Let's copy our panel. So here it's false, maybe because all of the values are 0. Let's try to connect a slider there to the input and see what we get. Still false, And when I go above 0.5, maybe there's a conversion to an integer and then to a Boolean, and then it becomes true. Does a point convert to an integer? Params, primitive, and integer. It converts to a 1. Does this convert to a color? In this case, it does. A point has 3 numerical values, as does a color in RGB space. So here, there is a conversion, and it seems it's just changing the R value of the color. If we had other sliders here, we start to affect the green and finally the blue. Does a point convert to a circle? I'm going to go to params, geometry, and circle. In this case, there's no clear way what that circle would be. There's no radius to this. It's going to give us a data conversion failed from point to circle. What about a vector? Yeah, I mean, in similar situation to a color, a vector is described as 3 values, and it looks a lot like the point itself. So it does convert to the vector, and there's no strange numerical conversion here. It's just straightforward use of the values as a value to a vector. This vector now is defined from 0, 0, 0 to this point. We see that in some cases, all of this stuff should make some sense. Let's finish up and bring down a circle. I'm going to go to curve, primitive, circle, see what this converts to. Let's start again with params, primitive, and Boolean. Does a circle convert to a Boolean? It does. It is something. The circle has some radius, so it's going to convert to true. Perhaps if the radius was 0, then we'd get a strange invalid circle, and maybe that would be false. Let's try to right-click on R, set the number to 0. Yeah, the radius is 0. The circle itself is an invalid circle, and we get false. So it's kind of a good way to check if things are valid or not. I'll bring that back to 1. Does a circle convert to a color? It does. What color is that? 128, 128, 255. Maybe the radius has something to do with the color? Nope. Sometimes, as you can see, the conversion, while it might work, maybe it's not so straightforward. I'm sure David has a good reason for why a circle would convert to a color. In this case, it might be possible, but maybe not a good idea to do that, just in terms of clarity of the definition. Let's try some geometric elements. Does a circle convert to a surface? Params, geometry, and surface. It does. You get kind of a planar trimmed surface out of the circle. Does a circle convert to a point? It does. If we pass a circle to a point, we get the center point of the circle. Does a circle convert to a mesh? Yeah, we get kind of an automatic meshing of the circle. Does this convert to a box? It doesn't convert to a box, but we get this bounding box around the circle. Does it convert to a line? Well, here, there's no clear way that the circle would convert to a line, so we get this error. Data conversion failed from circle to line. But circle sure can be passed to a lot of different data types, and a lot of different information can be extracted from it. Of course, there are other ways to actually convert circles into surfaces and extract the center point and have some more control over how it becomes a mesh. But I just wanted to show you a little bit of how Grasshopper deals with converting one data type to another.